right, it's 10 past. Let's get started. My name is Lars Egger. This is the IRTF open meeting. I chair the IRTF. I will step down March 2017, so we are starting to think about who might be the next IRTF chair. Talk to me if you want to learn more about what that is and how that works. Talk to the IAB. I would like to find a good successor. This is the IPR policy. The IRTF follows the same policy as the IETF. That should not come as a surprise to you. If anything you contribute here has IPR in it, we ask you, well, you're required to disclose that. We also ask that if you know of anybody else's IPR, that you disclose this as well. You can go online and look at this. Slides are online. You can remotely participate. We're being streamed. I think we're also being recorded. There's a Jabber room that isn't on these slides, but I think it's irtfopen@jabber.ietf.org. So if you are remote and you put a question in there that you indicate that somebody should relay at the microphone, somebody will do. I think it's Aaron. We have two lists. The IRTF announce list is super low volume. Basically, I'm using it for the ANRPs, and whenever a new group starts, isn't so often. There's a discuss list, which is also not very active or not very widely used, but if there's anything to discuss, it'll happen there. Announce is only I post. Discuss is everybody posts. The agenda, we have a little bit the usual, what's the state of the task force, and then the main event, as always, is the two Applied Networking Research Prize winners. So this is the last two prizes for 2015. The nomination deadline for 2016 is still up. I think I'm going to talk a little about this in a while. So we have two talks, 40 minutes each. I think the speakers are aiming for 30-minute talking and 10 minutes Q&A. I think both have said that clarification questions during the talks are cool. Anything that's getting more detailed, they want to hold until the end. I'm going to help them enforce that as well. But clarification questions, please go ahead. So the status of the IRTF. We have 5 meetings. This is a little bit less than we had in Prague, which was a record. Crypto Forum already met. I think information-centric networking is still meeting. SR Network Management has met. SDNRG has also met, I believe. I couldn't make it. NFVRG, I think, is still meeting. We are reviewing the SDNRG with the IAB on Thursday morning. We usually do 1 group per meeting. And there's 4 proposed research groups at the moment. 2 of them, the Human Rights Protocol Considerations group and the Thing-to-Thing research group, I think are very close to getting formally chartered. So I expect that to happen sort of after this meeting ends. The HOPSRG is a little bit newer, and we are still sort of trying to find the right focus for that. The name of that will change because we've realized the name that we inherited when this was over in the IETF isn't describing it very accurately anymore. It's now causing, I think, more confusion than being helpful. And the Network Machine Learning group had their very first meeting earlier today. So they also, they're still on the runway and they're trying to take off. But it looks good. There was a lot of interest in the room. So this is my personal sort of summary that's always very controversial of how the activity levels are. I always have all the chairs that aren't listed in green come to me at the dinner and say why I'm not in the green. My group is super active. So this is my personal impression of what I see on the mailing list. I only see what's on the mailing list. I don't see anything else. So around half the groups are active at the moment, and this always sort of changes. This is the usual status. The one group I want to mention is the DTNRG. They got really silent after the DTN working group got chartered a while ago. But I think they're also trying to now see if there's more research in that space that can ramp up now that the community has sort of gotten used to the fact that there's a working group, and the excitement of that has sort of dissipated a little bit. And as I said, there's 4 proposed groups. We have an IRTF stream where we publish RFCs. We don't publish so very many. We published 0 since Prague. That's also not unusual. So you see a few of those bars don't make it past the y-axis very much or the x-axis very much. But I think there's at least 2 or 3 from Crypto Forum that are in the pipeline at the RFC editor, including the curves document that TLS is waiting on. So I'm getting thumbs up here from the first row. So Crypto Forum did a good job there. yeah, we did this, this workshop on Saturday together with SICOM and the Internet Society. This was sort of probably, unfortunately, a one-off, given that, the ACM Internet Measurement Conference was in Tokyo last week, and we're meeting this week, so we had this opportunity to meet together with the measurement researchers, and we used it. That was the workshop we had. It was pretty well attended, I would guess. We had like 70, 75 people. We had 3 sort of topical sessions with longer keynotes, and then a whole bunch of lightning talks that actually worked quite well, and a lot of discussion. The entire thing got recorded thanks to the Meet Echo guys, and it's online, so if you want to watch 8 hours of fascinating lightning talks on your flight home, it's 4 gigabytes. You can download them, or you go to YouTube. So that worked well, and I think now we're sort of discussing a little bit also with SICOM and others, you know, what can we do to keep engaging the more academic research community more frequently, and is there anything else we could do like next year? One obvious thing is that we can do is have the research groups, you know, go out and meet at conferences rather than always at the IETF week, so a few of them are thinking about that. But there might also be something else we can do. All right, the Applied Networking Research Prize. You should all know this, we do this every year. I think we've done it now. We should actually check, Matt, if we have a 5-year anniversary coming up soon. I think we might. So we've done a few of those. It's funded by the Internet Society. We got additional support for Comcast this year and also next year. We got 33 nominations in 2015. We picked 5 of them as prize winners. We have a selection committee that has a few IETF folks, a few IRTF folks, and also some of the past winners are now serving on the committee. So Sophia Wang and Roland van Ryswyk-Deij. Okay, he's laughing. I'll let you correct me when you come to the microphone. I'm very sorry. Chinese names are apparently easier for me to pronounce than Dutch names. or Sophia is very gracious and doesn't. Anyway, so one of the things you get invited to give these talks, and that's the main event here tonight. So we're looking for recently published or accepted papers on topics that are research topics, but that are applied enough that they, you know, we think have an impact in the IETF or IRTF, or we believe they're, you know, highlighting something interesting that everybody in the IETF and IRTF should have heard, right? There are those papers occasionally. The nomination period for 2016, I extended it for a week. It was ending last Friday, but I figured since I have the chance to remind you all to nominate papers this week, I should do so. So November 6th, this Friday, is now the new deadline. So if you've read a paper recently, or if you've written a paper recently that you think would be a good fit here, nominate it. It's basically you fill out a web form and you upload the PDF. And then early December or so, we tell you whether you won or not. So do that. If you enjoy these talks and if you want to see more of them, help us find those. Yeah, I mentioned, I want to again stress, you know, we get some corporate support from Comcast now going into the 2nd year. Thank you. They need not stay the only corporate sponsor. So we're very open to having you all come to us if you work for industry or, you know, somewhere else that you know, has a way of funding this to help us. You know, we want to make it nicer for the prize winners. We maybe want to bring them back a couple of more times. There's a chance for a 2nd invitation at the moment. You know, if we had more money in the pool and the prize led to something really cool happening, we would, you know, be very open to maybe do some more of that. So we have lots of ideas for what we could do with the money once we have it. And contact Matt and me at ANRP@IRTF.org. All right, any questions on any of that before we go to the winners? And I'll give you a minute while I hand over the projector. Matt, quick question. Do we do plaques now, after? Okay. So the first winner is Sophia Wang from, where are you now, Sophia? You're at Facebook. Okay. So she's off the job market at Facebook. She's done a very cool paper on measuring SPDY, the Google protocol, and is going to tell us what she found.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. So today I'm gonna talk about my study on SPDY, which was done like 2 years ago at the University of Washington. I'm now at Facebook, but the work presented here has nothing to do with the work I'm doing at Facebook. Okay, so unlike many other IETF working group discussions, this talk will focus on the performance of a protocol instead of its detailed implementation. And particularly, I will focus on the performance of SPDY other than its other aspects, such as security or server workload. Okay. So HTTP 1.1 has been around for about a decade and has widely used by web browsers to load web pages. As web pages become more complex, it has been, HTTP 1.1 has been not as fast as desirable. So starting in about 2009, Google started deploying SPDY to make the web faster. SPDY has been deployed in many browsers like Chrome, Firefox, so on and so forth, and also used by many websites. But SPDY is very important because it's the basis of HTTP 2, which has been standardized by the HTTP-based working group. So this study has done 2 years ago, where HTTP 2 has not been quite there yet. But the performance, because these two protocols are very similar, I would expect the performance to be very similar as well. So now, we want to know the performance of SPDY, that is, how much better SPDY is than HTTP in terms of how much faster it can load web pages. Before I answer this question, let me give you an example of how browsers load web pages. Okay, this is a web page. We want to see pictures of kitties. Let's see how such a page will be loaded. Okay, to load such a page, HTTP 1.1 is commonly used, which has been also identified with several weaknesses. For example, to load such a page, HTTP 1.1 will open multiple TCP connections to fetch the embedded objects, even if they are served on the same server. So the concurrent TCP connections are likely to result in more congestion and are also hard to manage at the server. To load an embedded object, HTTP 1.1 requires the client to make an explicit request. The result is that, although the server knows that it needs to send to the client an embedded object, it has to wait for the client to make an explicit request. This is another RTT compared to what it should have. And in HTTP 1.1, only HTTP payload can be compressed, but not headers. As headers are growing larger, header compression becomes more desirable. Okay, so given the list of issues with HTTP 1.1, SPDY is proposed and aims at addressing these issues. Let's see what SPDY does. Instead of opening multiple TCP connections, SPDY just opens one TCP connection. It slices the HTTP data into multiple frames and put them into a single TCP connection. Also, within the single TCP connection, the web objects can be prioritized. And in SPDY, the server can initiate web object transfers and does not have to wait for the client to make an explicit request. And in SPDY, it can compress not only HTTP payloads, but also HTTP headers. Okay. Given the list of features that SPDY provides, we are still not sure like how much better SPDY performs compared to HTTP. So the brief answer here is it's a little bit unclear. If you look at Google's SPDY white paper, it finds that SPDY can help 27% to 60%. But if you look at some other studies from other parties, they find that SPDY sometimes hurts and sometimes helps. And in overall, SPDY helps about like 10%. The conflicting measurement results suggest that they might look at different web page characteristics or different network settings. So our goal here is to conduct a measurement study of SPDY that systematically sweeps the parameter space. We look at web page benchmarks and different TCP settings and network parameters. And then we would like to link SPDY's performance to these parameters and these underlying factors. We would like to identify the dominant factors for whether SPDY helps or hurts compared to HTTP. Okay, so to achieve these goals, we identified 3 challenges. The first challenge is that there are many factors that are external to SPDY actually affect SPDY's performance. Our approach addresses this challenge by isolating these factors and sweep the parameter space. In particular, we consider RTT, bandwidth, and packet loss rate as the network parameter. We also consider TCP initial congestion window. We consider different web page effects, including the size of the objects and the number of objects inside a web page. We exhaustively sweep the parameter space in all realistic ranges. The second challenge is that page load time has high variability. For example, we loaded the Twitter homepage for 1,000 times using both HTTP and SPDY. What we found is that the standard deviation of page load times is much larger than the difference between the page load times between SPDY and HTTP. So the variability of page load times comes not only from the network, but also from computation, such as some garbage collection events in JavaScript execution. So here, our approach is to control the source of variability. We control the source of variability from network by conduct controlled experiments in controlled network. We also control the source of variability in computation by using our emulator instead of loading in real browsers. And we can finally see our performance between loading using our emulator and browsers are really similar. Okay. The third challenge is that there are many dependencies between network and computation while browsers load web pages that can significantly affect the page load performance. When ignoring browser effects, we would expect web objects to be loaded almost at the same time, like this. However, when we consider browser effect, the objects will be delayed loading, so pretty much like this. It's clear that the page load time with and without considering browser effects are very different. And therefore, in our approach, we should preserve the browser effects. Okay, so this is the outline of the rest of the talk. It will focus on understanding SPDY's performance. We will start with a very simple and synthetic web object to exhaustively uncover the scenarios under which SPDYs help or hurts. And then we will move to more realistic but more complex scenarios. And at last, I will briefly talk about how we can improve SPDY with its advanced policies. Okay, let's first start with SPDY's performance with synthetic objects. Here is the experimental setup. We extensively sweep the parameter space that is these factors under these ranges. Specifically, we create synthetic object that lets us uncover corner scenarios. We ignore the browser effects and just make HTTP requests to these web page or to these objects. We measure the page load time as the time between we make the first HTTP request to the first object until we receive the last byte of the last object. So because everything is synthetic, there is no real pages being loaded, so we can only measure page load time in this way. Okay, after obtaining a high-dimensional data of page load times with both HTTP and SPDY under different scenarios, we can link SPDY's performance to these factors. So how are we going to do this? Here, we perform a decision tree analysis on this data because it tells exactly when SPDY helps or hurts under what scenarios. This is the decision tree we obtain. In the next few slides, I will highlight the branches under which SPDYs help or hurts. Okay, the first branch I'm going to talk about shows that SPDY helps on small objects. By small, I mean less than 1 TCP segment. The result is that, unlike in HTTP, a TCP segment can carry multiple web objects in SPDY. An example is that SPDY helps this page with 50 world flags. This is the web page advertised by Mod SPDY, which is an Apache SPDY module. And they found that SPDY can significantly help page load time of this web page without telling why. So here, we found that SPDY helps this page because it can embed many small web objects within a single TCP segment. And currently, there are many web pages that batch up the small objects into just one big image by using the thing called CSS sprite. So if SPDY is enabled, CSS sprite does not need it anymore. Okay. The second branch shows that SPDY helps on large objects under low packet loss rate. The reason is that in HTTP, there are multiple concurrent TCP connections that compete with each other. But in SPDY, there is just one TCP connection, so there is no competition. The result is that in HTTP, it will produce more retransmissions than SPDY. And this is why SPDY helps in this scenario. Okay, the last branch shows that SPDY hurts on a large number of large objects under high packet loss rate. Let me show an example. Here, we have 2 objects to load. So HTTP would open 2 connections, while SPDY would open just 1 TCP connection. Let's see what happens when there is a packet loss. When there is a packet loss, in HTTP, only one of the connections would back off the congestion window. But in SPDY, the whole connection would back off the congestion window. So the result is that in SPDY, the congestion window will be backed off more aggressively than HTTP. So in overall, we can see speedy hurts in this scenario. To demonstrate that this effect can be easily mitigated, we modify the kernel to let the TCP backs off less aggressively for speedy, and we can see that it can be easily mitigated. And if this thing can also be mitigated if we use a error correction code. So this branch, together with the previous branch in the decision tree, together show that most of the speedy's performance impact comes from the use of a single TCP connection. This is also true for HTTP2, so that's why I say the performance of speedy and HTTP2 would be very similar because both of them use a single TCP connection. Okay. Next, we are going to identify the dominant factors for how well speedy performs compared to HTTP. So we want to do this because we have lots of hypotheses as to what can we explain what can explain how much speedy helps or hurts under what scenarios, but we don't really know which of them are more important than the others. So the way we identify this is like this. We say the factors are more important if they are closer to the root of the decision tree. We say the factors are less important if they are closer to the leaves of the decision tree. And this is roughly what we found. We found that object size, the number of objects inside a page, and the packet loss rate more important than RTT, bandwidth, and TCP initial congestion window. So this is very different from what we expect for TCP's performance, where RTT, bandwidth, and loss rate are very important. Okay, so let me give an example that shows some factors are more important than the others. Here, this graph shows that the page load time of speedy divided by that of HTTP. And the x-axis is the number of objects inside a web page. We can see that it shows a descending trend. This is the same graph for the y-axis, but for the x-axis, it's the TCP initial congestion window. And we can see it doesn't really show a trend, which means TCP initial congestion window is a less important factor for speedy. Okay, and now let me give you an example about how this conclusion can be applied. We have a hypothesis that is speedy can help stragglers. Here is how we derive this hypothesis. We have a small object to be loaded and a large object to be loaded. So after the small object finishes loading, the large object, for HTTP 1.1, it has to rebalance the communication between the two connections. But for speedy, it doesn't have to because it only has one connection. So we would expect that speedy would help in this scenario. However, in our own experiment, we don't really find speedy to help in overall. The reason is that this hypothesis argues that with the congestion window, which is only a weak indicator of speedy's performance. Okay. Now let's look at how speedy performs with real web objects. This is the experimental setup. We still consider these factors, but instead of creating synthetic web objects, we download the web objects from the top 200 web pages. Here, we still make HTTP requests and still use the same definition of page load time. This is what we find. The x-axis is the page load time of SPDY divided by that of HTTP, and the y-axis shows the cumulative distribution function. So each data point here means a web page. Here we see that SPDY helps a lot in the median case. And the reason is that SPDY largely reduces retransmissions compared to HTTP. Next, let's see how well SPDY performs with real web page loads. By real web page loads, I mean there are browser effects. Let me explain what I mean by browser effect. Browser effect is a result of dependencies and computation in real web page loads inside browsers that can throttle the object loads. So our previous assumption in the previous experiments that objects are loaded at the same time does not hold anymore. Let's see how we preserve browser effects. We preserve browser effect by using our own developed emulator called Epload. So Epload consists of a recorder and a replayer. In the recording process, it captures the dependency graph of a web page using our previously developed tool called wproof, which is a tool inside a real browser. While loading web pages, it can record the dependency graph. And in the replaying process, Epload will walk through the dependency graph. While encounter a network activity, makes real network request with SPDY or HTTP. While encounter a computation, instead of doing the real computation like CSS evaluation, JavaScript evaluation, it waits for the same amount of time that the computation takes until it finishes. And after that, it triggers the other dependent activities. So the nice property about this tool is that it makes the experiments really reproducible because it controls everything. It can control the network by using a controlled experiment. It controls computation by emulation. So what we found is that with Epload, if we just load the pages for once or twice, the results will be very, very similar to each other. So we don't really have to worry about the reproducibility of the experiments. Okay. So this is still the experimental setup, but what's different is that instead of making HTTP request, we emulate the real page load process using Epload. This is what we find. The x-axis is still the page load time of SPDY divided by that of HTTP, and the y-axis is still the cumulative distribution function. This graph shows that SPDY marginally helps HTTP. And this graph is very similar to the graph that we find by loading pages using real browsers. So one reason that SPDY marginally helps HTTP under real web page effects is that the dependency and computation increase the page load time of both HTTP and SPDY. So relatively, SPDY helps less. And another reason is that the throttled HTTP, the throttled web objects loads actually also makes the resulting fewer concurrent HTTP connections and therefore less computations and less retransmissions, where SPDY actually helps less compared to HTTP. So by comparing this graph and the previous graph where we ignore the browser effect, we can see that the browser effect actually reduces the impact of SPDY both positively and negatively. Okay, at last, let's see how to improve SPDY by enhancing its policies. SPDY provides us with interfaces to prioritize objects and to do server push. But there is no concrete standardization on how to do the prioritization or how to do server push. It's pretty much up to the clients or the server. So this gives us an opportunity to improve SPDY. Let's see how we can improve SPDY by doing server push. So the straightforward way would be to push all the embedded objects in order to, within a web page, in order to make the most performance impact. But there is a risk of doing so, that is, the embedded objects can have already been cached. And if you on a cellular network, you're going to waste data usage. So our goal here is really to push to improve the performance as much as possible while using as less data as possible. So the way we do this is to leverage the information from the dependency graph we obtain from our tool. So the idea is that this is what it looks like for a dependency graph of a very simple web page. The idea is that we're going to push the objects that are closer to the root of the dependency graph first, and then the others. So the root of the dependency graph is always the root HTML web page. So for example, if we're going to do this, we're going to push the object on the second line first, then the third line, because the object on the second line is closer to the root of the dependency graph. Okay, so let's compare mod SPDY server push policy and ours. So mod SPDY provides to push by the embedding level. So what is embedding level? For example, pushing one level in mod SPDY means pushing all the web objects embedded in the root HTML document. So if we push one level in mod SPDY, it will basically push almost everything. But for our policy, we will just push one level in one dependency level. So here, in this example, what we see is that both mod SPDY and our server push policy can help page load time from 10% to 30%. Very comparatively, very similar to each other. But our policy reduces about 80% of the data downloads of the push byte compared to mod SPDY. And one reason that server push helps in general is that it breaks the dependency graph. And therefore, a conclusion is that improving page load time actually requires restructuring the page load process, such as doing server push. We also have some other experiment results in this paper. So we assumed one TCP connection for the entire web page throughout the paper, but this is not practical sometimes. For example, some web pages using ads or web analytics to track users or use CDNs to improve performance, and they are not from the same server. So we have to assume something differently. So we also experimented with, say, if we use one connection for things like drive.google.com and mail.google.com, and we also experimented with if we use different connections for different domains. So what we find is that if we merge the connection of drive.google.com and mail.google.com, we just use one connection for things under google.com, we can actually see that the improvement of SPDY is very comparable to the result we presented here. But if we still use separate connections for different domain names, it will be, the impact of SPDY will be much less than expected. Okay, and we also experimented with if we use SSL and if we don't use SSL, and the results are much similar to the results are very similar to what I presented here. Okay, to sum up, we experimented with SPDY and HTTP by loading web pages under a large set of parameters. We find that most performance impact comes from the use of a single TCP connection. We also find that browser computation and dependencies inside real browsers reduces the impact of SPDY. So to improve further, we need to restructure the page load process, such as using more advanced policies like server push. Okay, so this is the website. We have open sourced the tool, Epload, and also have all the data we presented here. So you are welcome to play with by fixing some factors and see how much it can improve things. And all the data points actually contains a trace corresponding to that. So feel free to download and experiment with that. That's it. Thanks for coming.
All right, you were very well behaved during the talk. Please ask questions.
Hi, I'm Dirk Kutscher. Thanks for the talk. So, in my perspective, so the first set of results that you presented, that largely corresponds to the intuition that you have when you know how TCP and HTTP and SPDY works. So, I mean, you using connections and so on. I had a question on your optimization with the server push, where you reported 80% improvement.
Okay.
Did you compare your server push modification against HTTP with caching or without caching?
Oh, so everything is like without caching, because if with caching, it's very hard to like define how much we have already been cached. So everything is like code load.
Okay.
Here.
Yeah. So let's test another question. So I think that's actually interesting, because so what your work seems to suggest is that there is some space for optimizing the interaction between client and server. So you did the server push approach, but it may be really great to have something that works well with caching. So maybe enabling the client to like request objects in a like more optimized order, for example, these kind of things.
Yeah. I think if the client can tell, if the client and the server can somehow like interact with each other, it will be much easier to say like which objects we should push or not.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Over excuse me. Over here. Rod Van Meter from KU University. It's very good work. It's very interesting. Thanks. Question on your Epload tool. How did you validate that against the behavior of actual browsers, comparing your tool to it to make sure it's actually doing what browsers will do in the real world?
Yeah, so that one is easy, because we actually, so it has like two processes. One is a recording process that actually records the process of page loads using a real browser. So if we can just say the replaying process, the process is basically almost the same or very similar to the recording process. They are mostly the same. But because we only record a specific instance of page loads, so we only can replay that specific instance of page load, but not the other instances.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Yoshi Nishida. I have one question. Have you ever tried several TCP implementation? Because there are a bunch of TCP implementation. Did you just try Linux TCP, or did you try another TCP implementation?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. So we only tried it under Cubic, which is the widely deployed one. But there could be, so for most of the loss-based TCP, because if it just like half the window by in proportion to whether there's a packet loss, it will be very similar. But if there are some implementations that can like reduce the congestion window by how many packet loss you have, it can potentially make a difference. But we haven't tried that.
Yeah, it's not only loss. Sometimes the TCP might stop because of application limitation. So that's, in such case, there might be some difference of the behavior of Linux implementation and other,
Yeah, there are very subtle like differences. So we just like try the most widely used one. But if the quick protocol is being used, it might make a difference.
Hi, Bob Briscoe. This is partly a question, did you think about doing this, or did you do it, or maybe someone else might want to do this? When you talked about importance of the various factors and how chose to decide how high they were in the decision tree, I guess that tells you the impact of each factor and how important the impact is on performance. But I guess another way of looking at importance is how much traffic is in high loss environments on the internet, how much is, how many web pages have small objects versus large, and what's the typical characterization of workloads that makes either SPDY or HTTP.
I see. I see. So that's an excellent question. So we also did so the decision tree we presented here is under the synthetic web object loads. Yep. And we also did similar decision tree analysis for the real web object loads and real browser effect. We can basically see the results are roughly the same, but the difference is that especially for the web object loads with real browser effect, we can see the concurrent TCP connection, or the number of objects is not as many as the synthetic objects. So in which case that parameter might be less important.
But I guess also the whole parameter space includes what network conditions are common. Yeah. What round trip times, what loss levels, and all the rest of it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Sophia? Well, thank you very much and congratulations. So next up is Roland. We're switching gears and going into DNSSEC land. And I will listen carefully as he pronounces his last name. It's easy, man, says the Dutch guy in the audience. Okay.
Okay. I'll pronounce my name first so we get that out of the way for lunch. So my name is Roland van Rijswijk-Dij. So but you can call me Roland. That's fine. I understand. If you say Roland, that's fine. And if you say Van Rijswijk, I also understand. So I'm going to present my work on the amplification effects in DNSSEC and how you can abuse that for DDoS attacks. This is joint work with my colleagues Anna Sprodo and Aiko Pras. Unfortunately, you'll see me staring back a couple of times because my display mirroring doesn't seem to be giving me any love, so I have to see which slide is on. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, just take it like that.
Better? Good. So just a little bit of background as to why we did this study. I work for the University of Twente, where I am a PhD candidate, but that's actually not my day job. My day job is that I work at SURFnet, that is the National Research and Education Network in the Netherlands. And we did some pioneering with DNSSEC, and that meant that we were the first signed delegation under .nl. We were also the first large network operator in the Netherlands to deploy DNSSEC validation in our production network. And we published a slew of hands-on guides and how-tos and blogging, etc., around DNSSEC, and you can find some of those on the Internet Society's Deploy 360 website. And if you've never visited that before and you want to deploy IPv6 or DNSSEC, please go there. So what happens is if you're the first guy to do this, you also are the first guy to run into trouble. We actually experienced two major issues when we started deploying DNSSEC, and the first of that one was to do with fragmentation. And we did a study on that. There's a citation for the paper on the slide, and you should be able to find a free version of that on my webpage. And that was published in IEEE Communications magazine. But the second issue that we ran into is that our signed domains were getting abused to create amplification attacks. And there was a whole host of these kinds of attacks during 2012. And we were not the only ones getting abused. There was some sort of backroom talk between operators about this. But that actually led us to want to study this. Just a brief primer for the people that are not, who's not familiar with amplification attacks, please raise your hand. Okay, so a couple of hands. Okay, very quickly. If you want to perform an amplification attack, you need to have some hosts that can spoof IP traffic. In the case of DNS, they will usually send this traffic to open resolvers, and the guy you want to attack, you spoof their IP in the DNS request, and then the responses will get sent back to them, and you achieve amplification because your request is a lot smaller than your response, and that means that you achieve amplification. You send a little bit of traffic, but you gain a lot of attack traffic. So just recapping the goals of DNSSEC, right? The goals of DNSSEC were to add authenticity and integrity to the DNS. And that was achieved by including digital signatures. And we also need to communicate the key material that we used to create those signatures. Otherwise, you can't validate them. And known critics of DNSSEC, and Dan Bernstein is one of the more vocal ones, said that this is one of the big problems with DNSSEC and this is why you should not deploy it. And actually he said, and I will quote him, DNSSEC is a remote-controlled, double-barreled shotgun, the worst DDoS amplifier on the internet. And if you want to look at his talk, the link is on the slide. This was an intuition, right? There were lots of back-of-the-envelope calculations that this should be true. It is an intuition, but nobody had actually bothered to measure this at any scale. And this is what we set out to do. So we wanted to establish some ground truth, what we did to grind the truth was to examine a large set of DNSSEC signed domains. So what we did was we obtained the zone files for ComNet, org, UK, SE, and NL, extracted all the signed delegations in there, and at the time of the measurement, that was about 2.5 million DNSSEC signed domains, and that was around 70% of all signed domains at the time we did the measurement, which was early last year. DNSSEC deployment has grown quite a lot since then. I don't have exact numbers, but it has round about doubled from this. The .nl zone alone already has 2.5 million signed domains in it at the moment. So what we did was we wanted to measure the amplification that you could achieve with DNSSEC and compare that to the amplification you could achieve with unsigned domains. There are two ways in which you can perform an amplification attack, right? You can either craft a domain to include lots of records which you know will give you a large response if you send a query for it, which is what attackers used to do before DNSSEC existed, and they still do it because we do some other research into DDoS attacks and we see them doing this. But the intuition was that if you have DNSSEC, then you can forego the crafted domain, and that has an advantage for an attacker. Because if you don't have to craft a domain, you don't have to register the domain name, you don't have to run the authoritative name servers, and that means that you are a lot harder to trace back. Right, so if they could do it with DNSSEC, that would be an advantage to the bad guys. So that's why we wanted to measure it. So what we did was we queried each and every authoritative name server for all these signed domains. We queried them over v4 and v6 to see if we saw any differences there. And we queried for a number of query types. So obviously we send any queries, which is the one that you, which is the first one you go for if you want to perform an amplification attack. We also looked at large text records, if any of those were there. Those are typically the ones that you see in crafted domains because they're easy to cram lots of data into. We looked at MX and NS sets because there are usually multiple MX records, there are usually multiple NS records in a zone. That means that your responses become a little bit bigger. We looked at the most common queries, A and quad A, and we looked at DNS key queries because if the public keys that we use in DNSSEC are large, so the intuition is that that response will be large and you will achieve amplification with that. So we measured the query and the response size. We measured the amplification factor you can achieve with that. We looked at the number of answers in all the responses that we got to see if there were correlations there. And we measured a lot of other data, metadata about the queries that we sent and the responses we got back. There's more information about that in the paper, but I'm not going to go into the details now. So let's look at the results. This is for any queries. And what you see on the left-hand side of the graph is the control group of unsigned domains. And what you can see here is that the average amplification that you can achieve with the 2.5 million domains that we queried over these TLDs is around a factor of 5. So that's not a huge amplification. And then if you look at DNSSEC on the right-hand side, which are all the colored lines, and I'll tell a little bit more about the shape of the graph later on. You can see that there are two peaks. There's one around 40 and there's one around 55. So that's significant amplification that you can achieve. Now there is another line in this graph, and that's the division that you see here. So what we did was we wanted to have some sort of metric of what would be an upper limit to the amplification that you could achieve with regular DNS, right? Because before there was DNSSEC, we had regular DNS. You could already abuse that for amplification attacks. So our assumption is that anything that you go beyond that is unacceptable, and anything that you can achieve with regular DNS, maybe it's unacceptable, but it's already achievable. So that is something that we take as a given. So anything beyond that is something we want to prevent. Anything you can do up until there, well, you could have done that with regular DNS, right? And this is not the whole story, because we saw outliers that go way further than what you can see in the graph. The highest outlier we found was an amplification of 179 times. And I feel a little bit guilty about this, but for Comcast.net, right, the good folks who sponsored the ANRP, and I've reached, I hear you laughing, but I reached out to them and we had a chat about it yesterday. But for them, we could achieve an amplification of 109, and that is mostly because sort of the higher amplifications are linked to additional and authority sections that are quite full in the DNS response. Olaf, I see a question.
Yeah, Olaf Kolkman, Internet Society. The line there is not really DNSSEC or not DNSSEC, but really EDNS0 support.
Yes,
and
it is.
EDNS0 support has been around for a long time. It's just required for DNSSEC implementation.
But we wanted to sort of that's correct. We wanted to have some sort of limit, and what we did was we took the smallest possible query and the largest possible response that you could have with classic DNS. And we wanted to stay below that, sort of to have a conservative lower limit. But you're right, it's actually EDNS, not DNSSEC, but I'm glossing over details, I'm sorry. Anyway, so for Comcast, for instance, what is the case is that the additional and authority section in the DNS response is quite full, and there are signatures included in this, and that makes those responses really big, and that's something you can deal with by providing minimal responses rather than full responses. And if you want to know more about that, there's information in the paper. So as you could see in the graph, there were two peaks. And when we saw this, that was kind of a surprise, and we started thinking, why are there two peaks? And we looked at the number of factors that could explain these two peaks, but actually it turns out it's pretty simple. The filled blue area, again, is the combined result, but the red line corresponds to DNS key response. So the number of DNS key, the number of answers in a DNS key query, right? And if that is equal to or below 4, and that includes the signatures, so it's not the number of DNS keys in the response, but it is the number of DNS keys in the response, including the signatures. If that is equal to or below 4, then you get the left peak, and that is basically when you're not doing a zone signing key rollover or a key signing key rollover. The blue line corresponding to the second peak is when the number of DNS key answers is above 4, which is during a key rollover. And the takeaway from this is that a tiny change like that has a huge impact on the amplification, because it raises the amplification by a factor of 1.5. So of course we also wanted, any is obviously getting abused for attacks, right? So we also wanted to look at the effect of DNSSEC on regular DNS queries like A and Quad A. And there the story is a little bit different. You can still achieve amplification, but it is not more amplification than you could achieve with classic DNS. So you could argue that this is not as bad. It's still higher than for the unsigned domains, but it is well within a really rather conservative limit that we set. And actually, if you look at the higher amplifications that you see in the graph, then they are mostly due to authenticated denial of existence, so NSEC and NSEC3 records, and I'll tell a little bit more about that later on. If you look at DNS key queries, the picture is a little bit more worrying, because what you can see for DNS key responses is that 38% of the answers exceed the limit that we set based on classic DNS. And this is a lot harder to mitigate because you need DNS key responses in order to be able to do DNSSEC. So you can't simply say, well, do away with some of the response, or but there are some solutions to this which I will get to at the end of the presentation. We also looked at authenticated denial of existence, so NSEC and NSEC3, because there were some discussions on mailing lists early on in the DNSSEC era that this would also be an amplification problem, and actually it's not so bad. Again, there are peaks; they are higher than what you would achieve for unsigned domains, right? An NX domain response is really small, but it's still within what you could achieve with classic DNS. And you see multiple peaks, and those peaks correspond roughly to the number of proofs that are in an authenticated denial of existence response. So you could argue that DNSSEC is this double-barreled shotgun if you only look at any queries. But on average, other query types incur far less amplification. The only thing that sort of increases the amplification if you look at A and Quad A queries, then it's the authenticated denial of existence. I know, for instance, that the folks at Cloudflare who are looking at deploying DNSSEC are doctoring NSEC3 responses to include a minimal number of responses in an NX domain answer. There's lots of discussion about that, but that would reduce the amplification impact vastly. It will also mangle the protocol, but okay. The biggest worry are DNS key responses, right? Because you have to have these to do DNSSEC. Now, what can you do to mitigate this? Now, there are a number of ways that you could tackle this amplification. The top two are actually under discussion in the IETF. The first one is to restrict or block any queries, right? Any queries basically are something that you use to debug your DNS setup. Do you really need to support that? Right, there is all sorts of software out there that uses any queries, but Dan Bernstein's Qmail, for instance, is infamous for that. But actually, even Bernstein has come online and said, well, the any query isn't crucial. We use it to optimize some stuff, but if it doesn't work, we'll fall back to MX queries. DNS cookies, so making putting some sort of authentication in the DNS query and a DNS response to prevent spoofing. Ingress filtering, BCP 38, BCP 84, but that's never going to be universal, unfortunately. Response rate limiting, which is something that you can do on your authoritative name server to sort of dampen attacks, which is something that got introduced after all these attacks in 2012. And response size limiting, so you could just cap the response size, send a truncated answer back, and have the client retry over TCP if you have a really large response. Unfortunately, no single deployed strategy effectively tackles all of it, right? Because it has to be, either it has to be universal deployment, or it depends on software changes. So what we did was we looked at an alternative. So why not dampen the impact of DNSSEC itself? And what is a way to do that? Well, if you look at what makes DNSSEC big, and if you look at our data, then what you can see is that what makes DNSSEC an attractive amplifier is keys and signatures. So if we can reduce the size of those, we can dampen the amplification impact. And the arguable root cause of that is that we use RSA as a crypto algorithm in DNSSEC, right? Because RSA, the most commonly used key sizes are 1024-bit RSA and 2048-bit RSA. Those are the ones that are used in 99.9% of our data set, right? You see some other key sizes, but 99.9% is these two key sizes. And as you can see, the signatures are huge, the DNS key answers are even bigger. If we can reduce that, that would have a huge impact. Now, alternatives exist, right? Elliptic curve cryptography has been around for a long time, and actually, the use of elliptic curve cryptography has been standardized in DNSSEC since 2012. It just sees very little deployment. 99.99% of ComNet and org domains use RSA. And I think I counted there were 13 that used ECDSA. So ECDSA, the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, was standardized in 2012. There is an alternative, EDDSA, which is even more attractive, and that is currently under discussion in both the CFRG group and DNSOP group. So we studied the effects, so we did calculations on what the impact would be if we were to switch to ECC on amplification. This is what the ANI picture would look like if we were to switch to ECC. And what you can see is that, so this is a repeat measurement that we did this year. You can see that the original amplification is more or less the same. There's a peak around somewhere around 40, there's another peak somewhere around 55. So that didn't change much. But if you were to apply ECDSA, then you'd get the dotted line. So the amplification you could achieve with ANI would still be above what you could achieve with classic DNS, but it would be a lot less than what you could achieve with an RSA signed domain. So that's already an improvement. And if you combine that with the fact that there is a lot of discussion about deprecating or blocking or limiting the impact of any queries, then that's promising. If you then look at DNS key, the picture is a lot better. Because even with the most conservative ECDSA algorithm, which is the biggest curve with the most cryptographic strength, which is P384 at present, then even if you were to choose that curve, which gives you the largest keys and the largest signatures, DNS key responses would stay within the amplification that you could achieve with classic DNS. And the paper about this actually shows that if you use ECDSA with curve P256, you could easily achieve DNS key responses that would fit in a classic DNS response of 512 bytes, which I think is great. If you look at A and quad A, the picture is even better. This is the CDF for A and quad A responses for if you were to use ECDSA 256. And you can see that all of them, all the responses that we got back would have fitted in a classic DNS packet, which is great, apart from the fact that you can't do DNSSEC in classic DNS, but they would have fitted in the packet. There are some considerations which are, of course, being discussed here at the IETF and in the IRTF CFRG. ECC shows promise. It virtually eliminates amplification, also fragmentation. More information about that is in the paper. It would also enable simpler key management. Again, you could much easier switch to a combined signing key. There's more information about that in the paper. The one remaining worry is that validation of ECC signatures is slower than validation of RSA signatures, and the concern is that you would be pushing some of the work that is now at the authoritative side, you would be pushing that to the edges toward the validators. So I had a student look at that, and he's just graduated. There's a link to his thesis on the slide. And the TLDR of that is that there's no need to worry, even though ECC validation is slower. Again, if you were to use the most conservative curve, which is P384, and even if you were to go for 100% DNSSEC deployment, you could do all the validation on a single CPU core on a moderately modern system. So with that, I reach my conclusions. So the work for which the ANRP was awarded confirmed the intuition that DNSSEC is actually a significant amplifier, right? So we now have the data for that. And that it's not the whole truth, right? If we do something about any, we can fix most of the problems in that. DNS key is something we need to tackle. Looking at ECC to do that is a great way of tackling that issue. Actually, we're going to write a paper based on the work that the student did in the past couple of months, and he did his simulations with one piece of software, only with Unbound from Nelnet Labs, but he's now repeating the experiments with Bind so that we have a conclusive data set for at least 2 common pieces of resolver software, and I intend to do a write-up of that and publish that as a separate paper, so if you're interested, look for that paper anytime next year. And then I think for me as a researcher, there are interesting times ahead because there are all these mitigation strategies under discussion, and it will be very interesting to see what deployment will look like once people start putting this in software and start deploying this on the internet. And with that, I thank you for your time. The datasets for the IMC paper about amplification are all open data. They're available through this URL. And I would also like to thank the funding bodies, which is the European Commission, the Dutch Gigaport project, and I would like the like to thank the Internet Society and Comcast for making it possible for me to travel here and present this today. Thank you for your time.
Questions for Roland, and I don't think you have to feel bad for Comcast. I'm sure they would consider it a reasonable consulting fee to have supported the ANRP. Wow, a room full of DNS people and no questions. All right.
They're going to torture me afterwards.
My name is Jimmei Tatsuya. Very nice talk, very interesting. Thank you very much. I'd like to check what you measured, just to understand it better. So did you send the queries to the authoritative servers all over the domains and then measure the size of the response, or did you do something different?
No, so we directly, let me see if I can find the slide. So we used the resolver to determine the set of authoritative name servers for each domain. And then we sent the query directly to the authoritative name servers, and we requested a maximum response size of 32 kilobytes. So I don't know how familiar you are with eDNS 0, but you can send the maximum response size you are willing to accept. And we set that high so that people would send us everything they had. We obviously did not go for the highest setting because we didn't want to trigger any corner cases in software that might be there. And then we measured the response size that came back, which is the UDP datagram size. And then we counted the number of responses in the answers, additional authority sections, and all that data is in the open data sets that you can download.
Okay. And regarding the mitigations, I thought the response rate limiting has been deployed probably since you first saw this problem in 2012. So I wonder whether the deployment changes the actual attack practice or not.
Yeah. So some people deployed response rate limiting, but it is certainly not universally deployed. And we know that some people deployed it because, of course, we had to work around it when we were doing our measurement, right? Because we're sending lots of queries, so we look like somebody trying to do a DDoS. Response rate limiting doesn't really solve the issue. It stops people from abusing your authoritative name servers. But it does not stop people abusing open resolvers, right? Because if you have enough open resolvers, you can still achieve significant attack volumes, even if the authoritative name server for that domain deploys response rate limiting. So that's problem number one. And problem number two, deployment of RRL is far from universal. Sorry, Comcast. Comcast did not deploy RRL, but it's not their fault. The software that they have simply does not support it yet. So they told me they have to upgrade their software. So that means that you need to have an upgrade path for your software. I think RRL was first introduced as a patch to bind, but it didn't get included in the mainstream version that is getting deployed in distributions until much later on. Is there somebody from ISC in the audience who wants to comment on when that became mainstream?
Francis Dupont from IEC, and seems I'm also only from IEC, so it's included in last distributions, but as you said, it took a lot of time to get it everywhere. Yeah.
So actually, I think it was included in bind 9.9. Is that correct?
Some version of bind on 9.9, but on 9.10 it's
yes.
standard.
But then if you think that some distributions like Red Hat are at a much earlier version, they have to backport these kinds of patches, it's not universally deployed. Does that answer your question?
In some sense, yes. So basically, your answer seems to talk about how to say theoretical analysis about what would happen in the real world based on the supportability of the software implementation. My question is more about whether you saw some measurement result in the field with the deployment of the RRL over the years.
So when we did the measurement, we did see, we didn't actually measure because we'd have to actively try to pretend to do a DDoS and then see which name servers were going to rate limit us. We didn't do that. That would be easy to do with the software that we have, but that was not the point of the measurement. My impression is that a number of large hosting providers, those were the ones that we got rate limited on. So a number of the large DNS operators do actually deploy this. But I don't have exact figures for you, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Back microphone.
Hi, this is Yoshiro Yonea. So I have a question about which kind, so did you analyze the data in DNS server itself, such as TLD servers or cache servers? So because any queries, the behavior of any queries, analyze of any queries which the resolvers or stub resolvers sent, it would be provide another aspect of mitigation, such as for if the only attackers wants to use any queries, then just stop or block the any would be a good mitigations. But if any queries come from much another usage, then we have to think about RRL or RSLs and such kind. So I think the analyzing behavior of who queries any would be a very good approach to say amplification amplification attack to DNSSEC is not so the worry thing.
So that's a good comment, right? So if I understood correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that you should also look at who sends any queries to authoritative name servers. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yes.
not only authoritative, but also recursive
Yes.
servers.
Okay. So actually, while I did not do that in a very scientific way, in the sense that I kept all the data and I did actually look at that. And I look at that on a regular basis because I am also operationally responsible for SurfNet's DNS infrastructure. And as I said, the first reason for doing the study was that our stuff was getting abused. So we actually monitor any queries constantly to see who is doing them and what the reason for doing it seems to be. So since this set of attempted attacks in 2012, that has gone away. So it's no longer the attack du jour. That's now some other protocol that allows you to spoof IPs. But what we see is that the any queries we get now are mostly random, and we can't explain them. There's probably some piece of software. But we see some peaks of any queries where we suddenly see them spiking, not worryingly, but we see spikes. And I'm afraid that after some digging, I found that they were fellow researchers who were lazy and wanted to get all the data, so they sent us any queries, and in particular for reverse DNS. We've seen that a lot recently. But yes, if you want to do deprecation of any queries, you should study who sends them. But then please go to the DNS working group on Thursday, because I think that draft is getting discussed. Right. Giovanni.
Hi, Giovanni Moura, SIDN. So a great work. I think you shed light on the potential of these attacks for authoritative name servers. So people who have configured their servers there and they're running there and they, by mistake, they cause this damage. My question is, how would you compare the potential of these attacks and amplification or damage and that the authoritative kind of attack that you analyze with the open resolvers in which you've done, it's not the authoritative server, but it's more like the ones that are in the middle and they do recursion and, they're open to resolve. So my question is, how you compare this type of attacks, which is more dangerous?
So the open resolver are an ongoing problem, right? The last figures I've seen is that there are around 30 million open resolvers on the internet, and that's not going down, despite the fact that people are trying to actively combat those. My intuition is that not every open resolver is as bad as some of them. And that is because of the way that any queries are answered. Because the RFC gives you some leeway in how you answer the query. And so if you send an any query to a resolver, it can elect to do two things. It can send you whatever it has in its cache for that name. Or it can do the full recursion, go to the authoritative name server and send you whatever response comes back. It's highly implementation dependent what the resolver will do. But if you, for instance, look at Unbound, what they will do is they will cache an any response. But the first time they will do the recursion and they will cache the any response. So that's not very helpful because you'll be getting the big answer. But what's even worse is that if it's a DNSSEC signed domain and it uses NSEC3, there is an NSEC3 param record in there, which has a TTL of 0. So it's cached for exactly 0 seconds. So the answer is it's highly implementation dependent on how bad the open resolvers are in combination with any queries. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end, unless anybody has anything else IRTF related. And as you walk out to the social, remember to nominate papers that you read so we can have talks like these two. They were very nice. See you guys in Buenos Aires.